Hey everyone, David Rishpan here again on YouTube. Welcome back to the channel. A bit of a different video today. Last week, my friend Gabriel Gaiardo, who's a fantastic pianist in Sao Paulo, posted something on his Instagram. He shared a podcast interview with a Brazilian record producer named Felipe Vassão. Forgive my pronunciation if I'm getting that wrong. And I'll just run the clip here.
Fazer música pop é a coisa mais difícil que tem. Fazer um jazz é baba, mano. Baba. Agora, fazer uma música pop estourada é foda. É difícil pra caralho. É um equilíbrio tão perfeito entre uma coisa simples o suficiente pra muita gente entender e complexa o suficiente pra você se interessar. Não é qualquer merda.
É verdade.
O cara fez Unicamp, o maluco estudou não sei aonde, foi pra Berkeley. E os malucos acham que música pop é um negócio menor.
So to translate and to summarize, what Felipe is saying is that pop is more difficult to make than jazz because in jazz you can do whatever you want and pop has more restrictions, and to make a pop tune that connects with a lot of people and ticks all the boxes in what defines commercial music, that's really difficult to do. And the thing he says at the end that I don't entirely disagree with him on. And then the other part of what he says is that music students who go to Unicamp, which is a University of Music in Campinas, Sao Paulo, which is a very renowned school, or Berkeley, kind of look down their nose at pop music because they're just jazz snobs, and the more complicated the music is, the better. These are arguments, these are debates that have been going on for decades. This is nothing new. But in listening to Felipe's excerpt on that podcast on Instagram, I don't disagree with a lot of what he says, but I do think it's framed in the wrong way. And I think it also brings up other problems in modern culture, contemporary culture, primarily the fact that we no longer really understand what jazz is and what jazz means. So the way I would frame this is it's not any genre. It's not that either genre is more difficult or more complicated or better or worse. The thing that Felipe is driving at, I think, or the real way to view this discussion is through the question of discipline. And do you have the discipline to serve the music, to serve the needs of the music, to do what the music is requesting of you? The discipline of doing a pop gig or producing pop music is an entirely separate or an entirely different skill set, I should say, than being able to recall a bunch of standards at the drop of a name, at the drop of a title, and being able to improvise over them. And even within that skill set of being able to recall a standard and improvise over it, there are different criteria, different settings in which you're going to improvise differently. If you're at a jazz aficionado jam session where you have the license and permission to take as many risks on the tune as you want versus being in a more straight ahead setting, whether that's determined by the venue or the clientele or the artist you're working with, do you have the ability and the discipline and the lack of ego to dial back the way you're going to improvise, to dial in the language you're going to use and play in a very simple and disciplined manner? A lot of my favorite solos in what we would call jazz music are incredibly simple and direct, with flashes of complexity maybe, but the majority of the solo is incredibly simple and direct. I would cite Keith Jarrett on Bye Bye Blackbird live at the Deerhead Inn, Sweets Edison on Did You Call Her Today, Milt Jackson on Things Are Getting Better. There's no shortage of phenomenal jazz solos that are incredibly simple and effective. And sometimes the simplest idea and the most obvious idea is the best idea. This is also not to say that there's no room and no place for complexity in pop music. Look at Adam Blackstone. He does not shy away from complex punches, complex harmony in his arrangements for lots of pop superstars, but it's done at the service of the music. It's not done to be flashy and look at what I can do and look at all the stuff I snuck into this tune. It's because he understands, and the artist he is working with and working for understands the energy or the emotional impact of utilizing a certain level of complexity, whether it's rhythmic or harmonic, at the right time, at the right place, in the right tune that warrants that type of language. The discipline required on a large production gig, whether it's a pop star or musical theater or Cirque du Soleil or whatever it is, I wouldn't say it's more or less complicated than being able to sit down and unleash sheer brilliance over standards and improvising. It's just a totally different skill set. And I have the utmost respect for my friends who work in the pop world, who work in the musical theater world, and have that commitment to detail, the attention to detail, and the ability to execute the exact same thing night in, night out. That's a skill set that I will admit is not really my forte. I am very much an improviser. The gigs I am on allow room for improvisation, allow the space to play parts when it's required, but then also open up as necessary. And it doesn't mean that I am a better musician because I get to improvise on my gigs, or that my friends are better musicians because they're executing at a higher level. It's just a totally different skill set and a totally different set of requirements on the gig. So in Montreal, there is a lineage of improvised groove music that has been going for almost 25 years. It starts with Community and kind of filtered down into Urban Science and Le Cypher, and now into Grove and a whole host of other jam sessions, improvisation sessions. I will link an amazing podcast on Nomadic Massive's channel with the founder of Community, Jasun, as well as the co-founder of Grove, Shem Ji, that kind of dive into the details and the history of this really important lineage in Montreal's music scene. If you haven't been to Montreal, if you haven't heard the history, definitely go listen to that interview. But I've seen it at Community, I've seen it at Le Cypher, I've seen it at Grove, where people don't understand what the goal of this type of improvisation is. And it's not just an open jam session. It is improvising with the goal of creating songs on the spot, which is a different subset of improvisation that kind of bridges the gap between, let's call it jazz and pop, or what a lot of people kind of assume happens at an open mic or a jam session. I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding both among civilians and musicians. You know, a jam session is not an audition. A jam session, to me, is a place to make music with new people that you haven't played with before, that you haven't played with in a long time. Musicality is really always my priority when I'm at a jam session, and I think it should be for everyone. It's not about showing off all my licks. It's not about trying to impress whoever I think might be hanging out in the club that night. That's not part of my calculus. When I am invited up on the jam session, my goal is to find a musical connection with the rest of my colleagues on stage as quickly as possible. And whether the language we're using is purely improvised or improvised within a certain construct, within a certain genre, or it's based on a tune, whether that's a blues jam or a jazz jam session or roda de samba or whatever it is. I'm trying to make a musical connection as quickly as possible. As someone who studied music, I have a master's in jazz performance from McGill University. There's just something that irritates me about throwing students under the bus in that podcast. Yes, there are insufferable snobs in schools, both faculty and students. But also, if anybody is determined and motivated and passionate enough to go into university for music in 2025, more power to them. And honestly, it falls on us as educators to get that commercial music stigma out of the school. Because if we think about the history of jazz music, at a certain point, jazz was the popular music of its day. And all the great session musicians, whether it's the Motown, the Funk Brothers, or the Wrecking Crew, I would say up until the late 70s or early 80s, most, if not all, of the session musicians that are on all the records we love, on all the records we idolize, had some kind of training in jazz and or classical music. It may not have been formal training. They might not have letters after their name, but they certainly came up playing jazz and or classical music. I don't think it's up for debate that contemporary pop music in the past 20 years has become less harmonically rich, less structurally complex. Whether that's a good or bad thing, I'm not going to weigh in on here, because I think there's a lot that can be done within the pop song format. I think there's a lot that can still be done in a 32-bar AABA jazz tune. That being said, one of my favorite songwriters and somebody I went to high school with, who is one of the top pop songwriters in North America right now, we bonded playing John Scofield and Pat Metheny and Fish tunes when we were in high school. So I know he has the background. I almost said baggage. He definitely has the background of playing more complicated music, but he is such a great musician that he just does what the song needs him to do. So that's my rant/lesson for this week. I think there's lots to be learned in both pop and jazz music. I think the dichotomy is a false one, and it all comes down to discipline. Are you a disciplined musician? Are you able to check your own ego at the door of the studio and serve the music in the way it needs to be served? If you enjoyed rants like this, content like this, please click like and subscribe. A lot of you are still not subscribed, and it really does help the channel. So please click all the little buttons under the video. My name's David Rishpan. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers.